of Columbia University, I want to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Cuba, Environmental Challenges. This is a particularly unique session that we have because we have probably the US's best environmental specialist on Cuba in the world, namely Dan Whittle, who will be introduced by our moderator, Gretchen Sanchez Higueras, and our second speaker, although they're going to dialogue a bit, is Giselle Garcia Castro from Cuba, who's actually resident in London right now, and who is the director and producer of Lista Quinta, a documentary film about sustainable fishing in Cuba and related issues that has won about over a dozen awards, I think, so far this year, et cetera. So, and we have that film up on our website so you can see the whole film, which is 75 minutes. I'd like to just mention that next month, November 17th, we're going to have a session on education in Cuba and the United States, comparisons, with Andrea Gabor from the City University of New York and Martin Carnoy of Stanford University. And they're going to compare the strengths and weaknesses of the educational system in the US and in Cuba, including their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And our final panel webinar of the year will be December 1st of this year, 2020. And it's a particularly interesting topic, and that is academic, sports, and arts exchanges, particularly the degree to which they have helped improve relations at times between Cuba and the United States. And it will include academic exchanges, it will include sports exchanges, and it will include dance exchanges. So we're looking forward to that a great deal. I'm now going to turn the mic, wherever it is, over to Gretchen Sanchez Higueras, who will introduce our speaker.
I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Dan Whittle, who is the head of the Cuba program for the Oceans program of the EDF in Cuba for many, many years, and has been a huge collaborator. And they're actually, EDF is turning 20 years now. They're celebrating their 20 years of collaboration with Cuba. And we're going to talk a little bit about their efforts here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what took for us to sort of create this environment of trust in order to improve the Cuba-US relations in terms of sustainability. And on my behalf, I am a filmmaker. We did a, sorry, Gretchen, are you there?
Yes, I am, but you can continue.
No, it's fine. I was just, I didn't really have anything planned, but, you know, pretty much we all know each other. So in terms of introductions, you know, we don't have to keep it that formal. So you can go ahead.
Thank you, all of you for bearing with us all these minor issues. So let me introduce you to our speakers today. First, ladies first. So I'm going to talk about Giselle Garcia Castro, is a Cuban filmmaker who graduated from the University of Arts in Cuba. As an undergraduate, she studied for a year in St. Thomas University, Minnesota, where she pursued a film minor. Giselle has engaged in different film projects as a producer, assistant producer, and editor for international and Cuban companies. She has directed her own documentaries with a specific interest in depicting social issues in Cuba. She's currently doing a master's degree at the Royal Holloway University of London. Lista Quinta is her first feature film. has received over a dozen awards for Lista Quinta. Among those are the Bronze Best Documentary in the Queen Film International Festival in California in the US. Finalist Liftoff Global Network in London, UK, nominated People's Choice Award, Big Scene International Film Festival in London, UK. Official selection, Liftoff Global Network, first time filmmaker in London, UK as well.
I wasn't expecting that list, but maybe we can just sum that up. Just to say
and the last one, but not the least, official selection in the Havana International Film Festival in Havana, Cuba. Dan Whittle is a senior attorney, senior director of oceans and energy programs at the Environmental Defense Fund. Dan plays a leading role in EDF's projects in Latin America and the Caribbean to promote sustainable fisheries and the conservation of coral reefs and other critical marine and coastal ecosystems. In 2000, Dan co-founded EDF's program in Cuba and since has been especially active in promoting scientific exchange and environmental dialogue and cooperation between the United States and Cuba. Dan also currently directs EDF's efforts in Puerto Rico to advocate for clean energy policies and to collaborate with rural communities to design and build low-carbon microgrids. In 2017, Dan was a recipient of a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Fellowship and spent a month researching issues on sustainable energy and agriculture in Cuba. This year, he was inducted into the American College of Environmental Lawyers. He's author and co-author of several books and publications. So let me set the rules. Please, all the attendees, let questions in the Q&A section window. I will gather all those questions and I will pass them on to our panelists once we finish all the presentations. This will be more communicative, so we will go from Giselle to Dan and vice versa during our presentation. So Giselle, you can take the floor to reproduce the video. We have a short 2 minutes trailer and then we'll go on with Professor Dan Whittle.
All right, guys, so if I can ask the panelists just to mute their microphones, that'd be great. And just to start off with a bit of introduction, we're going to present a small video, which is a trailer of the film Lista Quinta. It's just to get a sense of the issues that we're gonna be talking about a little bit. And then I'm gonna give the stage to Dan Whittle, and then we can continue talking about the film and sort of the different subjects and topics that are there. So is there? And enjoy.
Gibara, creo que desde que nacimos todos los gibareños nos criaron con, en vez de una maruga, nos dieron una atarraya.
Pienso que cada región de este país no vive igual. Todos tenemos diferentes tipos de vida. Por ejemplo, Guayabal lo único que tiene para vivir en una población de casi 5.000 habitantes es la mar.
Es evidente que cada año que pasa es menos la representación de especies.
Cuando una mujer está embarazada y la mandan a matar, el año que viene no hay niño. Eso pasa con el pez.
Siempre hay conflicto.
Hay que buscar un consenso, a ver cómo logramos pesca comercial privada, administración de parque nacional y tratar de convivir y evitar los menos problemas posibles.
Sí, espero entendernos, que nosotros nos pedimos mucho, porque nosotros los pescadores no queremos hacer daño a nadie, ni al ecosistema, ni a la fauna, ser un miembro más de ellos, pero sí que nos entienda que si se nos permite, vamos a hacer grandes cosas.
Okay, so Professor.
A little sneak peek. I'm gonna let Dan Whittle take the stage.
Great. Thank you, Giselle. How's my audio? Okay, excellent. So that was a sneak preview. There is more of that coming. So just bear with a few minutes of talking, and then we'll get more of Giselle in the film. But first of all, thank you very much, Meg Crahan and Gretchen Sanchez, for having us here. We hope to do this in April live, but this is the next best thing to being in New York these days. Also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Valerie Miller, who now directs our Cuba program, and Lalo Bonet, who's the senior manager and does much of the work on the ground. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about three things. Who EDF is, Environmental Defense is, and why we've been working in Cuba for 20 years. Number two, what are some of the environmental challenges facing Cuba now and in the future? And number three, how environmental issues simply cannot be addressed without looking at the people, the social and economic aspects. So for those of you not familiar with Environmental Defense Fund, we're a non-governmental environmental organization. We're guided by science, economics, and the law to find practical and lasting solutions to some of the world's most serious environmental problems. We're a global organization. We started small in New York over 50 years ago. We're now around the world. We're still based in New York City, and we're focused on 5 principal areas: climate, energy, oceans, public health, and ecosystems, so terrestrial biodiversity. And as Giselle mentioned, this is our 20th year in Cuba, 20 years of working with Cuban partners on marine and coastal conservation and other issues. And yeah, why are we in Cuba at all? 20 years ago, some colleagues and I were working in the Southeast US from North Carolina to Florida, focused on trying to convince the federal government basically to protect fish populations, to end overfishing and to protect habitats. And one of our scientists, we hired a scientist in Miami, and he had previously been doing work with Cuban scientists and showed that we're connected, that larvae from snappers and groupers and grunts on the southwest coast of Cuba are actually carried by the Gulf Stream to the southeast coast of Florida, where they become important for commercial and recreational fisheries. In other words, baby fish in Cuba become adults in Florida, where they're economically valuable. Also, large sharks, turtles, other marine life freely travel back and forth across the border, and no passports are needed in that case. So we realize that conserving marine life in the US depends, at least in part, on what our neighbor to the south is doing. Are fishing levels sustainable in Cuba? Are coral reefs and other habitats being protected? Does the government have laws and policies and programs in place? Is there enough political will in Cuba to protect the environment? We didn't really know any of this. And so we decided to go down in December of 2000. We attended a conference. There were 4 of us, 2 scientists and 2 lawyers. We all gave papers. And frankly, I expected that to be my one and only trip to Cuba. I was thrilled to be able to go, but really did not know what to expect. That's not what happened, obviously. We're still here. We were very warmly greeted by everyone we met in Havana, by scientists, lawyers, government officials, conservationists, who were frankly thrilled that a group of American conservationists were there to speak at their conference. There wasn't that much interaction between Americans and Cubans, some, but not a huge amount. So before we came back home that week, were already making plans to come back. I think why Cubans liked EDF back then was that we had a reputation as being fact-based and science-based. We're an advocacy group, but we lead with science and hard data. We took an interdisciplinary approach. We included lawyers, policy experts, economists, and we had a track record for getting things done. So in other words, the Cubans had done their homework before we got there. They knew who we were. And what impressed me on the first trip was just how far along Cuba was in protecting the environment. Specifically, I'm a lawyer, so I was really interested in all the policies and laws that the Cuban government developed in the mid-90s during the depth of the special period. So it was quite impressive. Since then, we've collaborated with Cuban partners on a wide variety of environmental issues. Most of our work together has been scientific in nature, has been designed to better understand ecosystems in Cuba and shared ecosystems. But all of it has been intended to produce scientific data that can inform decisions, either fisheries management or inform new regulations and new laws to conserve those resources. Way back in the day, we worked with Cuban scientists to identify the most important habitats around the island and to basically draw lines on a map that would allow them to establish marine parks. Since then, Cuba has developed protection of over 25% of its shorelines and coastal waters, which is truly astounding. If you think about it, in a country like ours, the figure is more like 5 or 6%. This is a two-way exchange, so we benefit as well. This is not just providing support to Cuba. We take advantage of the research that Cuban scientists have done to better understand how we can restore some coral reef ecosystems in our country. And we do that because much of what Cuba has, we've lost over the decades. Cuba has some of the most resilient and important coral reefs in the world, about 10% of the world's 50 best reefs, according to one group. And those coral reef ecosystems support not only marine life around the island, but coastal economies. They sustain fish populations, which are important for jobs and food. Also, Cuba is a biodiversity hotspot, so both in terms of terrestrial and marine. So it's a really important, place for the entire region. It provides, ecosystem benefits to the entire region. So, so the next part is, so what are the challenges? And what's going on? So since the mid-1990s, environmental protection, sustainable development has been a policy priority for the Cuban government. And remember that in the mid-90s, the special period was a time of tremendous economic crisis. At the same time, after Fidel Castro gave a speech in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 at the Earth Summit, the government started making the environment a priority. Lots of laws, regulations, programs, many of which have been implemented. In 2019, Cuba amended its constitution and added an amendment specifically directing the government to, quote, promote the conservation of the environment in the fight against climate change, which threatens the survival of the human species. That's in the constitution now, making Cuba, I think, one of 10 or 11 countries in the world that actually addresses climate change. Now, we can expect that to change. Hopefully in the years to come, it will be much more common for countries to address climate in their constitution. Cuba's been especially progressive on that issue. They've participated in international negotiations going way back to Kyoto. And they've been particularly aggressive in Latin America to get the region on board for addressing climate change. I should mention that Cuba, I think, accounts for about 0.1% of carbon emissions. It's a tiny amount, but part of their plan focuses on reducing, not just adapting to change, which is what they used to do, but reducing emissions. And that's a lot to ask for a country that's still trying to build its economy. We'll talk in a minute about this program called Tarea Vida, Project Life, which is this hugely ambitious, multi-pronged 100-year plan to combat climate change. So let's come back to that. Often when we talk about Cuba, we talk about how great things are, just what an incredible place it is from a natural heritage viewpoint. Those of you on the call who have been diving or hiking in Cuba, you know what I'm talking about. but Cuba has its fair share of environmental challenges. The same challenges that other developing countries have and developed countries have. Overfishing, which is an issue we've been working on, continues to be a major issue in Cuba, with over 70% of the fish populations either depleted or being overfished. Habitat loss, they've had a lot of deforestation over the decades. They've begun to bring that back, but they're still trying to recover native habitats that have long gone. That affects biodiversity. Soil erosion is a major problem across the country as a result of intensive sugar monoculture, which was sugar was king for decades. That had profound impacts on the soil quality, and in many areas are simply not recoverable. Water pollution, wastewater treatment is a major issue in most urban areas. Runoff is an issue in agricultural and other rural lands. Solid and hazardous waste management, it remains a major issue there, as does air pollution. Cuba has a distributed network of power plants, some large power plants and much smaller, microgrids, but most of the power in Cuba is generated with dirty fossil fuels imported from Venezuela primarily. Dirty diesel, dirty fossil. Biggest challenge facing Cuba of all, of course, is climate change. They've seen impacts for years, primarily in the form of intensifying hurricanes and storms and rising sea levels. The science in Cuba around climate change is quite impressive. For years, the Institute of Meteorology within the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment have developed very sophisticated models just showing the extent of impact in the next 100 years. I think these models predict that by 2050, sea level rise will increase by 1 foot, which is serious, and by 2100 by 3 feet. So that could impact over 6% of the total area in the country and affect tens of thousands of people who live in those areas. Climate change is also a serious threat to the resiliency of the coral reef ecosystems that are so protective of the rest of natural life in Cuba. So let me talk for a minute about bright spots. And we're still working there, and our colleagues in Cuba are still working hard because there's still so many opportunities. For example, Cuba didn't make many of the same mistakes that were made in the Caribbean, in the US and elsewhere for various reasons, political, economic, philosophical. But much of the Caribbean, we've seen high levels of degradation associated with, overdevelopment. Same thing in the US. The coral reefs in the US are nothing like they used to be. Seagrasses have all but disappeared from many areas in Florida. But if you go to Cuba, there's still an abundance of natural areas and natural ecosystems. And I think that the Cuban people really see their natural capital as an economic engine. They really see it as capital, and that there's an investment, there's a return on that investment in that natural capital. And tourism alone generates billions of dollars in nature-related tourism in Cuba. Another bright spot is science. Science matters in Cuba. There's a high number of scientists, and the government listens to science. They just passed a fisheries law last year that I think Giselle will talk about, but that was almost written by scientists, and it calls for science-based management. So science matters. Science knows. And if you're an American these days, that's refreshing to be in a place where scientists have so much standing. I'll mention again just the Tarea Vida, which is the National Climate Change Strategy. I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail other than it's a 100-year plan, but it includes short, medium, and long-term goals. A lot of it still focuses on adaptation. How do we get out of harm's way? How do we relocate coastal communities? How do we restore mangroves and other ecosystems, corals? But but also how we mitigate, how we reduce our footprint, our impact. And Cuba is making serious steps forward on transitioning to a low carbon economy, and that begins by weaning itself off fossil fuels for electricity and moving toward the use of solar, wind, and other renewables. And then, of course, the brightest spot are the people of Cuba. And I don't, you know, that's not a platitude. You know, the people are what will really drive the change. Specifically in the area of the environment and natural resources, we're seeing that stakeholders, the people most affected, are beginning to have a seat at the table, or beginning to have a greater voice in what the solutions should be. Environmental Defense Fund was involved in a project, really cool project called SOS Pesca a few years ago, and that was focused on 2 communities in the south coast of Cuba, Playa Florida and Guayabal. Guayabal is featured in the film. And basically, it was an attempt to bring fishermen to the table with scientists and government officials to say, what are we going to do about overfishing? How are we going to protect the habitats? What about jobs? You know, some were saying there's too much fishing, but we can't afford not to fish because there's nothing else to do. So what about alternative livelihoods? Well, SOS Pesca was a big success. And at the end of the day, you had everyone working together to come up with plans to protect these marine parks and to come up with new ways of fishing that, you know, resulted in taking a break from fishing depleted stocks and allowing them to recover. You basically had a bunch of cheerleaders and the fishermen because they were involved in the process. And so I think you'll see from Giselle's film that the best way, and arguably the only way of addressing these environmental issues, is by really thinking about the underlying social and economic drivers for behavior. Why are people overfishing? Well, they don't have an alternative, so that's the only thing they can do. When we were in Guayabal and Playa Florida, the fishermen say, we know things are changing. When I was a kid, you know, fish were this big, now they're this big. But as soon as you start sitting down and rolling up your sleeves and trying to figure out how to address these problems, you see a real different mindset. So, you know, I think the film does an excellent job of basically saying, here are the people who are closest to the resource. They know what's going on. They're the ones most affected. So it's really important to find ways for them to be part of crafting solutions. Since SOS Pesca, we've worked with Cuban partners to develop a learning network of fishing families around the entire country. So we have, you know, 100 fishing ambassadors from around the country who work with each other on these issues, share information. We also host exchanges with fishermen in the US, Belize, Mexico, and elsewhere with Cuban fishermen. So just this learning process, I think, has had a profound impact on conservation, a profound positive impact. So, so I'll just close this segment by saying it was a real thrill to see Giselle's film. I saw it last year at the Gibara Film Festival. If you've never been to Gibara, it's a wonderful fishing village on the North Coast. And since then, she's gone on to win tons of awards around the world. So I hope you all have a chance to see the film. Take it away, Giselle.
Oh, thank you, Dan. So just to have a look a little bit of have a flavor of what Dan has been talking about the coral reefs in Cuba, and just for you guys to have a sense of what that means, I'm just going to share real quick a couple of images that were taken by an underwater extremely talented photographer who kindly enough gave us some of his footage for our film. So I'll join you right after this. Great. So after this very relaxing transition, I'm going to start off by just saying that Lista Quinta was a film that started to, we started our research phase back in 2017. So it's come a long way. I find it like it's almost my kid. I'm very close to it. And now it's just pretty amazing to see how well it's been received by different audiences in, worldwide. The reason why we made Lista Quinta, and I always tend to talk about this film in plural because I always have to acknowledge the amazing crew that joined me in this adventure. So it's obviously a collective effort, and just a big shout out to all of them. They're all rock stars. Pretty much Dan and I had been collaborating in a couple of EDF projects, and I had been invited to record some of the sessions where they would actually have different people from different provinces in job positions in the high ends of the Ministry of Food, or fishing companies, or even just fishermen. So what I realized just attending to these sort of debates and sessions was that many times they used to be very focused in the state-owned sector, and there wasn't enough interest in what the commercial private fishermen were thinking about all of these laws. So pretty much the idea was to try to make that that sector more heard. It's not like we gave them a voice, because they already had one and they had really strong ideas on what things, in which path things should go. But I think that what the film does is just tell everybody that they are there, that they have really strong opinions about what's happening in their communities, that they are very willing to change a lot of things, and that they are willing to participate in the debate. And I think that that's the biggest achievement of the film in general. I think it was a little bit too ambitious, and looking back on it, it's a production from, we shot it actually in 2018. We premiered last year. We actually premiered in Gibara, like Dan was saying, the same day that they approved the first fishery law in Cuba, which was a huge thing for us, emotionally, because we were there when the news broke for our characters. So it was a really emotional thing to just be there sharing it with them. So basically, it was an ambitious film. We decided to go and film in 5 different communities, and we wanted to make sure to include the North Coast and the South Coast, because they're very different in terms of their resources, in terms of their management, in terms of even culturally their communities. So the whole idea was to have a look at from a human perspective, on how all of these environmental issues are having an impact on their daily lives, and how they could take some of the recommendations, but also understanding why there's a lot of inconsistencies between the official advice and the tarea vida that Dan was talking about, and how sometimes that just doesn't match very well in the practicalities or the logistics of how each town is being managed. And a huge challenge that I find in terms of management with the environment, and you can apply it to almost every sector in Cuba, is that most decisions are always made from Havana, and they don't usually take into consideration the specifics of each place. And there isn't a very stable platform or a reliable platform where people can just be part of that debate. And sometimes they would send scientists to these communities. So it's not like they're completely unheard. Sometimes there would be a couple of meetings or a couple of debates, or how we call it, I don't know, reuniones. But the reality is that it's not very consistent, and it's very just from once in a while. So I think that actually the creation of such platforms would be great for these communities, because then you would just have them constantly giving feedback and actually constantly making them feel like they're part of the process. And I think that's a huge thing, that they don't feel it like that today. So this film, obviously, you know, we can only go and film for a couple of days, because that's the nature of filming. So a lot of things have changed after we filmed. Like I said, the fishery law was passed, and a lot of things that are actually mentioned in the film have already changed. They haven't really changed, but they're like in the process, and they're in a good path. But there's also a lot of challenges that come with that law in terms of how it affects the people living in these communities. So just to have an idea of the kind of people and the kind of characters that we were looking for to depict the life in these communities, I'm going to show a small clip of this wonderful couple that live in Guayabal. And he actually, Javier, one of our characters, was actually nominated as best subject in a documentary. So it was one of those nominations that made me really, really happy, because you can tell the passion that the guy puts into everything whenever he's talking about the community. And I think that that was a shock for me, to find so many people willing to talk to anyone and super open to you know, not only hear but also give feedback. And you know, they just get excited about, you know, people being interested in their communities. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Javier and Cristina.
Era algo muy interesante. Cristina Rodríguez es la compañera mía que la conocí en la pesca. Me enamoré de ella y hasta ahora nos casamos. Hace 23 años que vivimos juntos. Tú echaste fósforo y los medicamentos, que no se me queden, porque si no por allá me da un papatón. Y es mi compañera de trabajo. Es la pescadora con la que yo lo comparto todo en la mar. Esa es Cristina Rodríguez, una gran mujer. Tiene tanto, ¿cómo decir la palabra? Tanto ímpetu de trabajo que nada, no la cohíbe en nada lo que haya que hacer, y nos compartimos la labor entre los dos. Y vivimos felices así, lo mismo en tierra que en mar. Yo creo que estamos mejor pescando que en casa.
All right, so those are the characters that we have in Guayabal, which is the second location that appears in the film. And Guayabal is one of those places where you go and, I mean, actually the entire film was edited and was structured so that it was faithful to my first experience going to these communities, because it was nothing like we expected, in the sense of how well received we were and you know, how vocal people were there. So I think that the film tries to capture that genuine connection of, you know, just getting to know the characters for the first time. And I think actually we always thought of including a fisherwoman as one of the characters, and sadly Cristina was not very talkative. But the passion in which Javier talks about her, I thought it was really cute. But it was also one of those things where you realize there's a lot of fisherwomen in those communities. And it's not even a debate. It's not even, you know, it's not like, oh, is this my position, or is this the kind of job that I should be doing? You know, it's just a given, again, because there's this thought that there are no other alternatives. And part of the reasoning behind the thinking of we have no other alternatives for work is because most of these communities, obviously they fish, but also they had a lot of sugarcane factories. I don't know how you say that in English, but anyways, they had a lot of centrales for the processing of the sugarcane, for the sugar. And a lot of them were just dismantled, and sort of 1/3 of the people just had no jobs anymore. So they all started to fish as well. So that also meant that there was an increase in the number of boats. So one of the things that is also being discussed in the new law is trying to reduce the fishing effort, which would mean that probably only the boats with engines would be able to go out and fish. So the problem with that is that, you know, as you saw, Javier and Cristina, they actually have to use rows, is that how you call it? So they don't really have an engine, so there's no motor to it. And obviously they're not as productive as other vessels might be. So there's just, and they don't even own their boats because they're not allowed to. So they actually have to rent a boat from somebody else and pay part of their salaries to somebody else who does nothing. And, you know, just all these kinds of things that unless you have been there and talked to people, we don't usually tend to stop and think about those when we're creating management plans and stuff. And well, we also saw in the previous clip, you know, the wonderful coral reefs and the how vital, and I always say that it was a wonderful accident, because I'm one of those who think that obviously there was a huge political will to pay attention to the environment, but there was also a lot of it that I think was by accident, and it's this like untouched beauty of the virgin land that is just there and is just stunning, because probably we never had the potential to exploit it more like it probably happened in other countries. And for good or for bad, and for the good things that are good for the tourism and, you know, the environment and everything, but it also has a huge bad downside for the people there, because this means that these communities were never able to flourish as cities or as towns. So they were never able to be exploited as such. And the conditions are just very primitive in a way. And there's also a conflict between the political will of trying to relocate them to more firm land, more towards the mainland, and take them out of the coast. But then that also means that the government is not giving enough resources for these communities to flourish as we would hope, because obviously the sea levels are just tremendously dangerous. So the government, what they want is, you know, for them to be safe and for them not to have to rebuild their houses every time a hurricane strikes, which is what happens actually. They have to rebuild their houses every year. So what happens, it's also the people and the passion that they have for the ocean, and that level of being, you know, that sense of being close to the ocean and to their boats, and being able to go every day and make sure that the boat is safe. You know, all of that is a lot of things that we have to take into consideration when thinking of the logistics of how that relocation would happen. And in this clip that we just saw, we were in Javier and Christina's house, which is actually one of the few towns that were rebuilt. So they were taken out of the coast and they built, I think it's like around 10 kilometers more towards the mainland. And they built a new community there that's called La Paloma. And they are extremely happy with it because it was in really good conditions. There were, you know, it was for free, and they, you know, it was pretty much the same community. So in terms of interpersonal relations, nothing really changed, but it definitely did change in the way that they now have to support each other and, you know, sort of make sure that there's a big group of people going to the coast so that there can be like a bus or a car or a truck taking everyone at the same time to the boat. So you don't really have that freedom of just going into your boat and go out and fish. So obviously all of this is sort of factors that are part of the things that we saw there that are not part of the film. And I'm mostly trying to talk about little things that happened that we saw but are not necessarily, didn't necessarily make the cut. So pretty much I want to show another clip, which is on tunas de sasa. And in this clip, I want you to pay close attention to how close you will see the coast from the houses of people, pretty much. And again, this is not like in America where climate change is still a debate and it's still sort of like something that people either believe in or not. When you go to these places, they know. And I go from one year to the other, and the difference is just massive. And it's just really shocking to be in those places, because it's a huge shook up on what your ideas are. So yeah, I'll just share with you a couple of clips about, just one clip about tunas de sasa.
Ahora sí. En esa posición ahí. Con chancleta ahí.
Desde que tenía 12, 13 años ya estaba con mi abuelo, con mi tío, pescando allá en los barcos. Porque aquí se vive más bien del diario que se hace. Aquí no hay más nada, ¿me entiendes? Aquí es la pesca y ya. Porque aquí como no hay tierra firme está aquí cerca de 5 o 6 kilómetros. La más cerca.
right. So hopefully that gave you an idea sort of geographically how these communities look. And this one in particular is one that is in a very shallow sort of surface. And one of the big issues there is that the relocation is not really possible yet, because they literally have nowhere to put them, because everything surrounded that area is quite shallow. So anywhere they would have that problem. And this is just a few group of people. This is one community that is very, very stubborn, and they really don't want to leave. And they actually make a lot of money, because they are the only ones in the country that are allowed to fish shrimps. So they just like being there, and they like that lifestyle, and they have no intention to moving out to a bigger city or anything. And it's just, you know, culturally, these are things that we can't really argue with it, you know, it's just how it is. And we have to sort of start to understand that side as well, in order to negotiate how to convince them to fish less, or how to convince them not to use the my English after 11 p.m. is not very good. Basically, how to use more sustainable methods to fish that are not so harmful for the ocean, for the coral reefs, pretty much. So one of the things also that I wanted to talk about is the communication challenge as well. And this is something that we know it's a problem in Cuba in general, but because there's not a lot of transparency in between, you know, the political will and the people. So that just leaves a lot of room for misunderstandings and gray areas, and things that just really would be really solved very easily with a very straightforward communication, but we are not great at it, sadly. So one of the things that for me was really interesting to see was in Santa Cruz, one of our communities. There was a huge team of flora y fauna, who are the people who are the conservators.
They manage the marine areas. The administrators. Yeah.
The administrators, right, for the national parks and the protected areas. So they have a very detailed management plan. So the scientific thought is there, the plan is there, everything is just so well and so thought out, and they have it, and they're able to explain it to anyone. And it's a wonderful thing. And their base is literally right across from the commercial fishing base. And when you go to the fishermen, they don't have a printed copy. So it's the kind of stuff that just blows my mind, because we think that, you know, obviously, you know, environmental challenges are a massive issue, but the other like little challenges that we have to make sure that, you know, after all of that effort was there, after all of that hard work of research and investigating, and we have to make sure that our communications systems are working more efficiently as well, because otherwise, you know, if it doesn't get to the fishermen, then it's not going to have an impact in the environment, because they are the ones who work from it. So that was one of the things, you know, and we actually brought a copy that we were given for free, you know, as a souvenir in this space, and we actually gave it to the people in the fishing bays, because you know, it's just things like that, you know, sometimes they leave there for so long, and you would think that is because they're so close. You would think that there's, you know, like a constant communication, but in fact, sometimes they need a little push to continue talking about these issues, because otherwise, you know, it just turns as part of their routine, and then we have like a huge source of motivation for a week or with one project for 1 month. So we have to make sure that we're really following up with these processes. And I do remember very well, and Dan mentioned the SOS Pesca project, which was wonderful. And part of that project also, I think they gave out like sewing machines and in Guayabal, which really made people very interested in other areas that were not fishing necessarily. So, you know, the creation of all of these alternatives is really important, because it's not that there are no alternatives, it's just that there's not enough motivation for people to be entrepreneurs. Because once you see it, it's there, and you can, and I went to like a small restaurant in Guayabal, which was opened by a single mom with her daughter and her granddaughter, and they do amazing stuff there. They literally every hurricane, they reuse all of the, they are able literally to reuse everything in a very sustainable way. So I'm not even because, oh, you know, because they are aware of climate change or anything. It's just out of need, pretty much. But, you know, if we start to encourage those sort of, you know, that kind of behavior, and if we encourage that kind of business, we can actually reduce the fishing efforts, not by taking away fishing licenses, but to actually creating other spots where people might be interested in, like English classes, so that people can be hired as tourist guides, people from the community, because they're the ones who know it best. So sometimes you have to send, sometimes, you know, state-owned companies, they would send people from Havana to these places because I can't find people in these places that have the right education or the language, or, you know, just the resources to actually, or the training. So these are all kinds of things that we have to be looking in, how to motivate other areas so that it's a more natural, more organic, and more, you know, and it'll be great for the communities, really. And it's going to give jobs to people in all sorts of different sectors, not only fishermen, but also elders, and also probably younger people. And it might make people want to stay there, because migration is a huge issue as well in these communities, because the lack of opportunities. If you don't want to be a fisherman, you just leave town, basically. So we're seeing a lot of people growing old in these communities, and only until now, with the new fisherman law, this has changed. But until now, they did not have retirement, which was something outrageous, really, because, you know, if you see the clips, you know, most of our characters are sort of like over 50 now. So these are people who have
young,
their entire lives. Yeah. But, you know, like, how long are they going to be able to do this, like, massive physical effort? And that was a huge concern, you know, how are they going to, now with the new law, how is that going to work? Are they going to take into consideration all the years that have passed by of these people working and selling their fish to the government as well? So these are all things that are also challenges, in my view, of, you know, how there's this impact there in the communities.
Giselle, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, of course.
There. So a couple things just to echo what you said. First of all, the film was a great learning tool for us. We were involved in SOS Pesca, and we learned a lot of things from SOS Pesca that has informed our work, not only in Cuba, but in Belize, Mexico, Chile, Peru, the Philippines. But I think seeing the film, we learned even more because of your focus on the private sector, as you mentioned. So you amplified voices. But the cool thing is that, you know, we often think of Cuba as being in a category of one. You know, Cuba is so different. Cuba is there's no other place in the world like Cuba. Well, that's not true in fishing. In the film, and I think SOS Pesca really showed that the universality of these issues. I mean, they're the same all over the world. They're even the same in North Carolina. If you go to a small fishing town in North Carolina, you'll hear the same thing. I'm worried about retirement. You know, I don't have anyone to pass my boat on to. you know, there aren't any other jobs here. So if I can't fish, what can I do? And so we found that communication is important. You also have the disconnect between the regulators here in North Carolina and the fishermen. So the communications thing is really important. The learning networks that SOS Pesca spawned are now working in Cuba to not only communicate, but it's the continuity you were talking about. So making sure that it's not just one person showing up in the fishing village every 1 year. So there's a dialogue going on. And that learning network model in Cuba has now been adopted by our colleagues in Peru and Chile, in Spain, in the Philippines and elsewhere. So Cuba almost is like a lab when it comes to small scale fisheries. We're learning a lot from how they're doing things. Also, Cuba's learning. The Cubans are learning from examples in Belize on how you tie together marine parks and fishing and stuff like that. So you know, I think your film does a great job in kind of bringing some of those issues to the surface, but also helping us recognize ourselves in those fishermen and fishermen. That's why the fact you have an international audience now with all these international film festivals reflects that this is not just a film about Cuba, and that's why I think it's so powerful. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think that actually when you were talking about the efforts and, you know, sort of the need to work in conjunction, you know, in the Caribbean, and, you know, the fact that this is definitely, you know, a shared resource that we all have to take care of. Otherwise, you know, the efforts of just one country is not going to make any difference, really. And I think that, you know, visiting these communities is literally the same thing, but in a much micro scale. And this just reflects that, because most of these fishermen, they have never been to other fishing communities. So after we made the film, we first thing that we knew that we had to do was, you know, take the film back to these communities and show it to them, and just, you know, get some feedback on how they think these issues are being handled. But the great thing about it as well was that they were able to see how were other communities, you know, and if you take that and if you think, oh, it's, you know, different communities, like the community right next to mine, but that is just also like a metaphor to all of the, you know, collaboration internationally, how it should happen as well, you know, just to be better connected, because otherwise there's no point. Like in the specific case of Guayabal and Santa Cruz, who are actually both in the South Coast, there was something that I heard that is just, for me, I mean, it's funny, but it's not really. Basically, because of the price difference that they pay in one company in Santa Cruz, they pay a much higher price for the same fish than they pay in Guayabal, because the production levels are very, very different. So what happens is that they actually, the fishermen from Guayabal and the fishermen from Santa Cruz, they share the same fishing space, and they actually sell, the people of Guayabal sell their catch to the people in Santa Cruz, and they make that transaction in the ocean so that the people in Santa Cruz can get more money for it. So obviously Guayabal is never going to, you know, that company is always complaining about that because they know what's going on. And it's just stuff that we think about it, and we can't really have more sort of surveillance in the waters, because that, I mean, obviously the ocean is too big and we don't have the resources for it. But we don't even have them for the mainland, let alone, you know, just send out boats, you know, to patrol. So we have to figure out other ways to, you know, just incentivize so that this change is, again, more organic, so that it's not constantly by force or, you know, or spending resources that we know we don't have. And the other, so really quick, because I know I'm leaving out of time, but I'm just going to mention real quick other challenges that I've seen, is the safety. The safety of these fishermen is a huge challenge here. When you talk to them, they say actually here they pay more attention to the species than to human life. And that seems a little bit extreme, But when you think about it, these boats have no safety at all. They have no GPS track. There's nothing, no one can take care of you if you don't do it yourself. So I think that's something that we have to also factor in, because when the people, the scientists say, oh, this key is really important for conservation and for marine life, and so they ban the key, so the fishermen cannot go there basically, because it's like a protected area. But then if that's the only key in the entire region where they can actually go after 4 days of being fishing and just get out of the boat and cook something like really quick and just rest, you know, where does that leave us, you know? So these are the kinds of things that I think the information is there. It's not, obviously, you know, I'm being very picky in the little things that I experience, but again, if there was like this kind of platform where this constant feedback could be given, I think that would make a huge difference in the ways that the management plan is actually implemented. And the other challenges I think that are more sort of in a social standpoint is what are these communities left to? And we have to actually say this, because, you know, it's not in the film, because that wasn't the point of the film. The point of the film was very clear for us from the beginning, but alcoholism is massive, because there's nothing else that they do. There's no other businesses really. So basically they spend all day fishing, watching TV, socializing, and drinking. So violence is a huge issue in these communities as well. Machismo as well. I don't know if you could see the cap in one of my characters. It said, cocks, like the fighting cocks, give me money and women take it from me. So, you know, these are all like things that I think could change with the right motivation in the certain places, and trying to back up and echo the right voices. I think it's really important. So I'm going to leave it there. I could think of tons of things, but I'm actually want to leave some room for questions. And sorry, I've gone over my time.
Let me add to that, Giselle. So in the question, anyone who has a comment or question, just type it in, and we'll look at those and respond to those. You know, I wanted to give a shout out to, we've talked a lot about fishermen. We've talked about, you know, government officials. I want to give a shout out to the scientists in Cuba. They often serve as the bridge between, you know, the people on the water, the fishermen, and the people making decisions. The University of Havana, the Center for Marine Research, is a partner that we've worked with. They've done a phenomenal job in creating these courses for professionals and for fishermen, for seafood enterprise people, and for government officials to come together for 2 weeks and to be in the same room learning together about science and management. And it's really interesting when they become students, because it's just a really great dynamic. There are games they play, there are exercises, there are, you know, working groups. And in the first course that the Center for Marine Research produced, they developed, I think, 4 or 5 fishery management plans for some of the fish populations that were in trouble. And at least 2 or 3 of those are being used now by the decision makers to help restore and rebuild those fisheries. There are also, I mean, there are excellent scientists elsewhere. The Center for Fisheries Research in the Ministry of Food plays a key role in assessing fish populations and setting the rules that fishermen ultimately have to abide by. The National Center for Protected Areas within the Ministry of the Environment is the one that identifies and sets the rules and management plans for many of the protected areas. And then you have a group like the Foundation of Antonio Núñez Jiménez, which is Cuba's largest environmental organization. And they're the ones who do a lot of the community engagement, much like a group like ours would. And they're all made up of just really impressive scientists. So in creating the platform that Giselle's talking about, there are many different kinds of platforms. and we're seeing those take shape. So there is more of a participatory, atmosphere around solving some of these resource issues. So.
Yeah, definitely. And absolutely, like, these scientists are usually the ones that not only have to take care of science, they are the ones who have to go yearly to this, what I did in like two weeks, I actually go and they do it all the time. So they absolutely go way beyond what their job description should be, and if I just may add, and they do a terrific job in also trying to gain the trust of the fishermen, but also try to educate them at the same time, like little by little. So yeah, huge shout out to them. Definitely, they do deserve it.
Perfect. Thank you, both of you. Actually, we have several questions, and I do also have questions, but let's start with Professor Leogrande. Professor Leogrande is asking, what could a Biden administration do to build cooperation with Cuba on environmental issues? Either of you can take that question, or both of you.
Should I go first? The Biden administration could do a heck of a lot to foster a clean and healthy environment in both countries to the benefit of the people. If you look at, we've been there 20 years, so we've been working in Cuba in good times and hard times. And for many, many years, some of the only and best cooperation happening was scientist to scientist. That was an area that was less political. So in the early 2000s, we were able to go back and forth to Cuba and talk about environmental issues because they just weren't that controversial, really. But nonetheless, we had to apply for licenses. It was very complicated. We couldn't get Cuban scientists here. That all changed in 2009 with the Obama-Biden administration. And so we saw that in all respects, the world changed between US and Cuba relations. We now have diplomatic relations, of course. And Professor Leogrande has written a really great book called Back Channel to Cuba that documents all this over the decades, including what happened in 2014. But what we saw was that the environment was really kind of a peace offering between the two countries. It was one of those issues that was kind of safe to talk about. So it was a confidence builder, it was a bridge. For several years before 2014, we were able to facilitate conversations between government officials in the US working on fish and government officials in Cuba. We even had a floating workshop organized by the Center for Marine Research at the university, where we had fishermen, scientists, and government officials from Mexico, Cuba, and the US on the same boat for 4 days. And talk about drinking, Giselle. I probably shouldn't go there, but it was just such a important relationship building experience in 2011. So that by the time that relation started normalizing, you already had some conversations happening on the environment and science. And this is just one of several examples. And so I think that, if you look at the 22, 23 agreements that the two countries negotiated during the Obama-Biden years, the first two were on the environment. And the first one was kind of a direct result of that boat trip. But 10 out of 22 deal with environmental issues. Most of those agreements are actually still in place, but they're frozen. We haven't seen very much activity at all between the two countries on science and the environment. Groups like mine can still go back and forth and work on projects, but we can't bring Cubans here. So basically, what Biden administration can do is to rewind the clock to January 19th, 2017, and at least put us back to where we were. So these collaborations can continue to produce benefits for both countries, but then from there, really build and take it to the next level. We have so much work to do together on climate change. As I mentioned before, Cuba is a leader in the region. climate and clean energy is a priority for the Biden administration. This is an area where Cuba and the U.S. could team up and do great things, around the region. The U.S. could help Cuba transition from dirty fossil fuels to clean energy. Cuba has so much, leverage over the region and could influence how we address climate change. So on and on and on. So Giselle, from your perspective, what do you think?
Oh man, I mean, I think that, Biden could do so much, but it's just so hard to keep it to the fisherman sector, because it's just literally any kind of change in the US-Cuba relations, just the echo of it is so massive and the impact is so big in Cuba that it's just really hard to even put into words, because I think that it's not only about the collaboration. I think that if we just think of the amount of people that are living elsewhere and that would like to open up businesses and that would like to see the potential in these areas, it's huge, really, because again, it's this untouched kind of Virgin Island that obviously, if the travel restrictions are lifted, that would be massive for tourism and for the economy. But also, I think that giving people, I think that the Cuban government wouldn't have a choice but to actually open up the way it sort of did a few years ago with the Obama administration. And, just the opportunity and the job potential for the people would be massive. And again, I think that it would help a lot to diversify in these communities. But also, again, the shared knowledge, it's really important. I think that we sometimes take it for granted, but because we are collaborators, but it's not well known at all the efforts and all of the plans that Cuba has in terms of the environmental goals. And I think they're very worth it. I think that the US and the entire world has a lot to learn from us in that sense. And obviously, we're not the best publicized country in the US, so that affects us a ton. And we don't have the credibility to actually be even part of a worldwide conversation, if you will, So I think that that it's the perfect timing because the way has been paved already. I think that there's already trust built by the work that EDF has done previously. As Dan was saying, there are loads and loads of different ways in which this collaboration can happen that we always find, I don't know if this is fine to say, but we always find loopholes to make them. And, it's one of those things that would be really good for us. I think I can just leave it there. It's a lot.
Okay, perfect. So Greg Clave is asking, who lobbied for the first fisheries law? And I would add, if you can mention some cons and pros and cons of in the bill, in the law.
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
So Greg Clave asks, who lobbied for the first fisheries law? And if you can mention some pros and cons in the law.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna do this one real quick because obviously, Dan is probably better equipped than me for this question. But can I just say, this fishing law has been a long time coming, and I think that it took a long time precisely because of how much they were taking into consideration all of the factors that I just mentioned as well. We're not very well known for being very spontaneous in our lawmaking, so definitely this is something that was really thought out. And that it's not, it's not a couple of people kind of conversation. I think that there's just a lot of history that goes behind that law. And there are a lot of pros, most of them are pros. And some of the cons I think I mentioned from my perspective is how it could affect the amount of boats in the ocean, and how that could be. But overall, I think it's a very positive law, and there's just still a lot to, to see what's going to happen. But yeah, Dan, you can go on with that.
Yeah, I'll just add that it was a very long process, and that we certainly didn't lobby. We don't lobby in Cuba, and there's not the same lobbying culture, I should say, in Cuba. However, this was a long time coming. I would say 5 or 6 years from scientists and officials in the Ministry of Food basically saying the old fisheries decree law doesn't really do enough. Probably 2009, when they did allow some private commercial fishing, that's when the conversation kind of started that we need additional rules to modernize, to catch up with what's going on in the water. So this conversation was going on for a while. During SOS Pesca, some officials at the Ministry of Food basically said, we know there's a problem, but we don't have the science to justify reducing the harvest in the sea. So we need better science, and we don't have the resources to collect the data in the field. And so long story short, but we worked with Cuban scientists to develop methodologies for assessing the health of fish stocks. When you called data poor, when you don't have enough data, there are ways to model what's going on the water. We trained scientists, we trained fishermen and officials, and basically they then did a national fisheries assessment showing where the trouble spots were, and then prioritizing different species and fisheries for management. All that was happening while the law was being considered. About 3 years ago, the government created a fisheries policy, which is basically a framework for the law. That was debated internally among many, many different ministries, including the Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Food, and others. And then that turned into a draft law. That's not something that we were a party to, but our colleagues who we worked with on the science and the management were party to that. So, you know, we participated in processes that helped, you know, build capacity and build the information that then went into the fisheries law. And again, it's a far-reaching law. It requires science-based management. You know, I think there are lots of pros. You might say the cons are it doesn't go far enough. There are things it doesn't address, but can be addressed in regulations like illegal fishing. Cuba just passed a set of rules a few weeks ago addressing illegal fishing by foreign vessels. More needs to be done on addressing illegal fishing domestically. And then the entire sector of recreational fishing. I think someone's mentioned in the chat or the Q&A, you know, what happens when things, you know, open up again? Well, one sector that can really grow is tourism fishing from the US. If you go to the Bahamas, you'll see thousands of boats, and it's really had a real impact on fish populations in the Bahamas. Same thing could happen in Cuba. The recreational fishing sector it's addressed in the law, but it doesn't anticipate the kind of changes that could happen. So there's more that can be done, but it's a really important and excellent you know, first step.
Yeah, I think we also have to consider that the law is a law, and then it's a very general, broad outline of the government will, but after that law, there's just tons of regulations where the more specifics come, and that's where we'll know the actual impact that it has, but there's just a lot that needs to be worked on there.
Okay, Clara Rodriguez is asking, have you developed any relationship with fishers in Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic? There seems to have many similarities with all these, among all these countries in the area. I know that EDF has a project with Puerto Rico, and well, you can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking. There was a good article this week, today actually, about artisanal fishing in Puerto Rico. The size of Puerto Rico is a smaller island, of course, and the size of the fishing fleet is much smaller. What they're able to produce from the sea there is much less. However, they have many of the same species, many of the same kind of fishing culture. Dominican Republic is a bit larger. So the good news is that there are several Cubans who work in Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic as part of the Caribbean Biological Corridor. And basically it was initially the DR Haiti, and Cuba to address migratory birds, and basically what all countries were doing to coordinate. It's recently expanded into fisheries, and Puerto Rico is now a member of that. So even though the US technically isn't a member, there's a US territory. So their focus is increasingly on building capacity, on fisheries science and management. And one of the tools that we co-developed with Cuban partners is something called Fishy. But it's this tool that you assess fish populations when you don't have a lot of data. We've now translated that into Chinese. We use it in China, but it's in Spanish now and in Haitian Creole. So we're just beginning to see some more regional collaboration. EDF does not have a program on fishing in Puerto Rico, although just this week we had an internal conversation about how to do that, because there are changes in the federal approach to fisheries management where they don't group the Caribbean islands anymore, like US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. They treat them as states, essentially. So there are new opportunities. There's a big need, and hopefully that will be part of the future. And again, I think Cuban fishermen have a leg up and a lot to teach their people in other countries.
Mm-hmm. Teresa Garcia asks, which are some opportunities for learning and collaboration between Cuba and other Caribbean countries in this area? Are there ongoing projects? And can you talk a little bit more about SOS project, the SOS project?
Yeah, I'll just say there are tons of opportunities. And part of it is the learning networks we talked about. Those learning networks are both internal and they're international. So the EDF and other groups have seen that great success in learning exchanges. So we've taken Cuban fishermen to Cape Cod, to San Francisco. We've taken Mexican fishermen to British Columbia. We've taken fishermen from Texas to places in Canada. It doesn't matter if the fisheries look alike, or fishermen always have a lot to talk about, and they always have lessons to share. The same thing can be done in the Caribbean. There hasn't actually been as much of it in the Caribbean. But I think the template is there. I think the challenge, Teresa, is that is US-Cuban relations. It really makes it difficult to include Cuba in those regional conversations, particularly if the US is involved. Cuba certainly can interact with other islands, but once the US is involved, our government basically says, we're not going to show up if the Cubans are there. So again, we're kind of back to where we were before 2009. But the need is tremendous. And I would just close by saying it's all about climate. So what brings the Caribbean together is the fact that all of the Caribbean will be affected by climate. Many of the fisheries, many of the fish populations will migrate north, which means there'll be a net loss in fish biomass, which means if you don't manage the fisheries you do have well, the impact in the future will be even that much worse. So there's a focus on climate resilient fisheries, and the Caribbean really must start working together.
Okay. Professor Phil Brenner asks, who in the Cuban government has seen Giselle's film, and how receptive have government officials been to the film's message?
So yeah, this one I'm going to answer it along with, I think there was another one speaking about the impact that the film has had. And I mean, can I just say, I'm only a filmmaker, guys. So I'm obviously, I don't know of a film that has changed, the course of history to this date. But I can say that it does, improve a lot of the conversations, and, just having people just have some time to think of these things, for me, is just enough. And I think that just seeing the characters watching the film and coming to me and, picking up on some things and, or even, deepening their debate, I think that was great. After we showed the after we had the screening in all 5 communities, we actually presented it in the communities before we presented it in Havana, because we thought that was just the fair thing to do. And only with their blessing we were able to, you know, go and show it in Havana. In Havana, we're able to, again, using a lot of the, you know, EDF contacts and other contacts in Cuba that have to do with the environmental sector, we're able to invite quite a lot of people. And there's definitely people that saw it in the Ministry of Food. Again, a lot of scientists that collaborate in the Center of Marine Research in the University of Havana, and people from the CIP, which is the Center for Fisheries Research. And you know, pretty much, I think even people from Florifauna have also watched it. And I'd say like the biggest authority in these issues would be the Ministry of Food, because we don't really have a Ministry for Fisheries. It's just a sort of department that it's inside the Ministry of Food. So I personally talked to the director of Fisheries Regulation back then. He actually changed recently, Borrodo. And I showed him the trailer and everything, and we had a really interesting discussion, because obviously, you know, because I went to these communities and I had such a close relationship with these fishermen, I always try to be sort of on their side. But his point was, you know, if we actually open up just a little bit, like you're trying to propose in your film, or, you know, how the way that they want it, you have no idea what a massive impact that would have in the environment if we release it just by a tiny bit. And that made total sense for me, because it's true that that's their nature, and it's true to that if they let loose some of those regulations, it might be a bit chaotic, given the situation where these communities are right now. So that made me think a lot, again, you know, on how complex these relationships are, and how important it is to have the different stakeholders just be together and talk about this. But I've definitely gotten excellent feedback from all of the government companies, and even the fishermen companies as well, because they all do understand that it's an issue. And it's not like, I think that they have taken that very mature step, that they are not so worried about how they're being portrayed, but they're actually more worried about what's being said. And which is not an accident. We took a long time editing to try to make sure that, you know, we were debating about the right things and not other things. So yeah, I think, but actually in that sense, we were extremely polite with everyone. And I think that paid off for what we wanted the film to achieve. So yeah, pretty much that's been it.
Okay, so Joe McAuliffe asks, what impact on the environment do you expect from the economic reforms that seem to be emerging? This is a prediction question, a little bit hard, but do you have any predictions from the economic reforms and their impacts on the environment?
So the recent economic reforms in Cuba, you know, that's other than to say that, I mean, the short answer is no. It'll be interesting to see whether the government develops policies that shift the balance toward more, you know, economic development, and at the expense of the environment. Historically, they haven't done that. After the opening of U.S.-Cuba relations, there was a real effort, not always successful, but a real effort to strike a balance between environmental protection and new commercial development. In the case of domestic reforms, I think there is a concern because of the tension between food security and sustainable fishing. Early on, there was some notion that they would relax some of the regulations and allow fishing in spawning areas and other areas that should be off limits, just to address the short-term acute need of food. And that's a legitimate motivation, but it could have longer-term consequences. So, John, I can't really answer the question. I think it's too early. I think just from my vantage point, I think allowing more enterprises. I think there's a lot. If you motivate, as Giselle was saying, if you allow people to fish and take their fish to market, they can catch fewer fish and make more money if they're able to market their seafood in a certain way. So I don't have it again. I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think there is within the government, in my experience, behind the scenes, there's a real conversation about how to strike the balance so you don't sacrifice the environment for short-term economic interest.
Okay, thank you. So Professor Arturo Lopez-Levy says, when you discuss your experiences of cooperation in the environmental area, it seems that there are dimensions of empowering Cuban communities of scientists and fishermen. Have you presented these experiences to the so-called democracy promotion community in the U.S.? I noted that institutions such as the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, or even the National Endowment for Democracy claim frequently that engagement with Cuba lacks a civil society promotion dimension.
Giselle, I'll take that real quick. Environmental Defense Fund, we are a large environmental organization. We are active in environmental advocacy, particularly in the U.S., particularly on climate and other issues. In the case of Cuba, we lead with the environment. We are not, we focus on environmental cooperation and dialogue between the two countries because it's to the benefit of both countries, as we've been talking about. And the proof is in the results. I think few people, dispute that basic point that environmental cooperation and dialogue works and it's important. In terms of civil society and participation of civil society in Cuba in natural resources, again, I think, the proof is in, recent history, SOS Pesca, where you do see, broader participation among those affected, stakeholder groups, et cetera. I would say, I was surprised when I started working in Cuba. Cubans are really opinionated, and there's quite a lot of debate around everything. In the case of the environment, when they passed a landmark environmental law in 1997, it was the subject of fierce debate, with some arguing that we're going way too far on the environment. So there is a conversation. I think what's changed in recent years is, that's extended more into the communities. There are platforms that are emerging, I think, somewhat organically. And I know that there was a previous seminar, on civil society. I would say, from my experience, there's quite an organic, platform that's becoming more formal. And the fisheries law provides, additional opportunities for stakeholders to participate. So it's a good question. And there's not a simple answer. I haven't engaged with those groups. We do work with other groups in Washington, WOLA and CDA, Center for Democracy in the Americas, and others who promote engagement over isolation. And we basically think engagement works. It works for most issues, if not all of them, and particularly for the environment.
So Glenda asks, I think that to Giselle, when Javier describes the relocation of his town to a site further inland, he calls it the best thing that ever happened in his life. How common is this type of enthusiastic reception? Could you comment on some of the other attitudes you encountered with regards to the home migration?
Well, I have to say that Javier, in the case of Guayabal in specific, is very particular. there. So you know, it's really hard to say that that's just a trend in the line of thought of, you know, how they feel all about the relocation. I think that what makes Javier so excited about it in particular is that that was, you know, the particular hurricane that hit them that year was really, really tough. And they did see, they lost everything, literally everything. And they had, you know, it's just having nothing. And then in less than a year, you already have, you see the builders, you see the change, and they don't want to go through that ever again. And the fact that they were able to recover so quickly and so, you know, in a very distant way, you know, it's not like, you know, I sometimes still see the process of recovery of other countries in terms of hurricanes and things like that. And it doesn't make any sense to me because I just grew up with this given that we are very good at responding to these kinds of natural disasters. But I will say that it definitely changes in terms of community-wise, depending on how well your community is doing. I don't think that Guayabal in particular has a huge, there's a lot of potential, but right now there's really nothing that you'd look forward to stay in the coast other than being close to your boat. It's just like that. If you think of other communities, maybe the progress that Gibara has made in, you know, in many ways also because of the film festival actually that it's happening there, and you see that they're building hotels and you see that there's like a lot of businesses and a lot of job opportunities. Obviously they feel differently, and actually it's making people from the main provinces go to those places as a hotspot, you know. But in Tunas de Sasa, which is the last location of the film, you'll see that they're really stubborn. They don't even want to have all the vessels in one place because they don't trust each other. So, and they say that it's because they don't have a space, or they don't have like a natural sort of geographical accident where they can actually make a base to have all the boats and have some like security guard there for it. So the way that they live is they literally have, and it's just like a little, sort of like a peninsula. So they have water, they have the ocean, and then on the other side they have a lagoon. So they literally have just one main street that if you want to go back, you have to go all the way to the end of the street, turn around in a stadium, and then come back, because it's just like a tiny main street. And then you have houses to both sides. And then they have their boats like they're their cars. They're just parked in the back of their houses. And I thought that was very unique. That's actually one of the reasons why we shot there, because it was very different from all of them. And, you know, they don't want to know about a collective effort for, you know, the vessel security. And they don't want to know anything about relocating, because that's the community that everything that's nearby, it's still sort of in the same conditions. So the property prices are ridiculous. It's really, really low, again, because they have to rebuild it every year. But they still won't go. And I did meet a woman in Guayabal who was very reluctant to leave. And she said, I can't leave because as soon as I open up my door, I have to feel the ocean. I have to feel el salitre, no? I have to breathe that, and I have to, and that's it. And I'm going to die here, and no one is ever going to move me from here. So yeah, there's just a lot of, you know, challenges there in terms of moving some stubborn people. But again, it all comes with education and making them aware of some issues that they probably haven't thought of because they've been living there their entire lives. And I think that if more opportunities are created in other areas, that will automatically attract people towards that. The only reason why the guy in Tunas de Sasa left Tunas de Sasa was because back in the Obama administration, he was just able to open a paladar in Santi Espiritu. So he just left, and that's it. And then things got tricky, the taxes went higher, and then he went back to Tunas de Sasa. So again, it's, you know, it's these little changes that you see in people, but when you put it in a timeline, it makes sense.
Yeah. Greg Clave asks, why did a woman from Havana do a film about fishermen, communities, and industry in rural Cuba? And I would add, what were some of the major struggles that you encountered making the film?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm from Havana, you know, that's a fact. And I think that, you know, I was saying that a lot of the efforts and a lot of the regulations and the main institutions for regulating the fishing efforts are based in Havana, as being the capital city, obviously. So again, all the research centers, the University of Havana, obviously, and all of the different foundations, they're all established there. They have some partners in the in these communities. Also, the film school is in Havana, and I studied film in Havana. So I wish there was, you know, like a film school where every year, like you know, a filmmaker from Guayabal could make a film about their own community, but sadly that's not the case. So what I can say that is that I think that we actually took a lot of time to really be connected with these people, and I think, you know, still to this day I have really good relations with them. And you know, I wouldn't know how to fish, and I don't think they would be able to pull off this kind of film and move it around as I did. So, you know, at least I think that I've learned a lot from them, and I think that this film has been great for them as well. And I'd say that my biggest interest was, you know, again, because of all of the conversations that we were collaborating in Havana, it's that they would bring people from all of these different provinces. And I think that also became part of the process on how we collaborated together to decide, you know, it wasn't just that I said, oh, these are the locations where I'm going to film. You know, I had a lot of support and advice from different, you know, a lot of different institutions, and I had like informal interviews with them, and I gathered like a huge pack of conflicts that I was seeing from different stakeholders, and that's what I sort of tried to go for when I went to film. And in terms of the challenges, you know, the film permits were really, really hard. Hopefully none of you noticed, but you probably did, is that we don't ever go out in the ocean and see them actually fish. And that's something that still haunts me to this day. And a big part of it is that we didn't have the film permit from Capitanía del Puerto, which are, you know, the people that give you the permit to go out, actually allow you to go on a boat and film, you know, in the overseas. Not overseas, sorry, you know, out in the sea. So that's, you know, it took a really, really long time. And then at some point I just decided to do it with the permits that we did have, and then just avoid that bit and just have them sort of like getting ready and going out. Like we just assume, you know, like fishing is hard. I hope everyone knows, period. You know, there are other films about how hard it is. And we're going for a much more, you know, the focus in the communities themselves. But yeah, I'd say the permits were the hardest thing. The rest was a blast, really. I'm not going to complain, you know, and we had a great time. My crew is fantastic. The editing was really, you know, ethically challenged, and I learned a lot from it. And the distribution bit has been a blast as well, and it keeps surprising me. Today I would have done the film completely differently, but it's there, it's what it is. And, you know, I'm happy about it.
Thank you. So our time is up. We don't have much time now, but I want to thank Dan Whittle, Professor Whittle. I want to thank Giselle. I hope that you could read some of very nice comments talking about looking forward to seeing your documentary film and wishing you the best of lucks with all your documentary in the future. So I want to thank all of our attendees. That I want to personally thank Giselle and Dan, and yeah, let's hope for the best for the documentary and for the environment in Cuba. We look forward to seeing a new administration that can make better things for the environment in Cuba and for the two countries. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you guys for having us, really.
Thank you. And several people have texted me asking for a link to the film. And Gretchen and Meg, I think you've provided a link. You may want to do that again.
Yes.
But it's, yeah, it's a wonderful film. And thank you very much.
Exactly. Yeah. I think in the announcement that we sent out, the link is on the announcement and also on the flyer. I think that you can find it. But I will make sure to put the link of the documentary film on a new email that I'm going to send out as well with the link of this recording video. That will be,
Quite honestly, you know, if I think that if you just Google it, it might appear on Vimeo. So Lista Quinta, it should appear like that. Otherwise, you know, we are happy to share the link, and we would love for you to watch the whole thing. So that's also highly appreciated.
So we don't have a nice way to say goodbye. We also, say goodbye, and people can start exiting from the room. Thank you, all of you. I'm looking forward to November 17th, talking about education in Cuba and the US.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you all.
Bye.